Hello learners, welcome back to lecture number 22 of this course on Sociology of Media and Communication. So, today we are going to talk about digital ethnography as part of unit 3 on digital media. Now, digital ethnography is one of the most exciting research methods that have become very popular in this contemporary times, particularly because it combines digital and ethnography, both which are not only buzzwords, but also of contemporary relevance to us. Now, the digital revolution is something which we have been speaking about both in the Indian and the global context, primarily in terms of how the digital has shifted from being an extension to something which is an integral part of our lives. Now, primarily when we think about the digital space, it is not just a physical infrastructure kind of mode of operation, but also a way in which many social beings interact with each other. It also becomes a methodological lens, it becomes a way to understand society, and therefore, there has been an upsurge in research on the digital space. Now, a digital sociologist and digital social anthropologist have both looked at the digital as a space primarily from different kinds of angles, and in the Indian context, if one sees, digital anthropological research has looked at demographic diversity. As you know, India is a large and diverse country, and therefore, the possibilities of that demographic diversity is huge. Then they have also looked at rapid technological adoption, because India is also one of the most largest and best users of the internet in terms of numbers, and then also strong cultural traditions in terms of how does the digital, the social and the cultural come together. Now, one of the questions that we need to sort of ask is, how do digital platforms reshape cultural practices and identities in India, and how are traditional social structures reflected or challenged in online spaces? What role do digital economies, online rituals and political mobilization play in contemporary Indian culture? Social processes that accompany the development of the digital communicative and information technologies are equally important. So, the Indian context in fact is a good example to understand how the digital is connected to the social and the cultural. So, methodological and epistemological reflections on the study of such phenomena have become very prevalent, where people look at the way that research could be done in the digital space also as a methodological tool. Now, in traditional social anthropological and sociological research, ethnographic methods are seen as a research tool and technique to study participants in their natural habitat as part of their social settings. It is also guided by the idea of what Clifford Geertz would argue is thick description. Now, in digital ethnography, what you have is an adaptation of ethnography. So, it is not something which is unique in the way that theoretically it has no connection to ethnography itself. What is unique is the site. In traditional ethnography, it is the physical field site, whereas in the digital ethnographic methods, it is the digital which is the primary site. Now, the digital ethnographic methods, they as a research strategy primarily use the internet sphere. They then look at online social practices, networked relationships, representations, and again questions of moral orders, cultural orders of online activities. There has also been a cultural turn in communication research, which means that a lot of research happening in the communication space were guided by the fact that communication is culturally, socially embedded. It cannot be studied without looking at the culture of a particular society. Now, in this context, in the cultural turn, ethnography as an adequate methodology for studying the conditions of production, reception and consumption of media is considered to be something which is very desirable. And this this is why digital ethnography primarily becomes useful as a research method. Now, media ethnography, which is a part of how you would think about doing ethnography, it seeks to develop an understanding of active audiences by exploring what would be genre readings, issues of race and gender, family living and identity, and media ethnography sought to understand media as a cultural form. I will make a distinction between digital and media ethnography in the sense that media ethnography could be about non-digital media as well, whereas digital ethnography restricts itself to digital media. Ethnographic studies of primarily media in nature or media oriented could be seen as internet studies, then social studies of technology, communication and media studies, etc., and these have been primarily ethnographic in nature. In this lecture we will talk about digital ethnography in detail, and Christine Heen was primarily someone who talked about the internet as an object of study, and he theorized it in two ways: as a cultural form, where there was a focus on cultures of internet, which is the study of specific cultural forms based on the internet, for instance netiquette, emoticons, webcam girls, hackers, etc. So, these are cultural forms and cultures of the internet which could be studied through a digital ethnographic perspective. The second theorization is that of cultural practices, where the internet may be analyzed as a cultural artifact and the study of practices not necessarily specific to the internet, but acquire different dimensions online. So, this is primarily the practice of culture that is in focus. Now, the ethnographic method and internet studies, they have used three different approaches. So, while this is the theoretical division, or let us say the theorization, the second thing on your screen is primarily the approaches to study the internet. The first one is virtual ethnography or ethnographies of cyberspace, which could be the internet culture's beginning period to the late 1990s, and what has also been happening in the present context. The second is connective or online or offline ethnographies, which is the expansion of the World Wide Web, and the third is the ethnographies of the internet in everyday life, which looks at development of social media, social networking sites 2005 to present. So, you see a historical evolution of also the approaches. You have the first one, which is virtual ethnography, the second one which is connective, and the third ethnographies of the internet itself. Now, these approaches have guided our understandings of the digital sphere. Now, let us first talk a little bit about virtual ethnography. So, the virtual ethnography is conceptualization of the internet as a new kind of social space. What is here important is space, where the internet is looked at as a space. The cyberspace conceptualized as an immaterial place where disembodied selves freely interplay, form virtual communities, and where new social and cultural patterns flourish. So, in the cyberspace you have virtual communities like let us say Reddit subgroups or Facebook groups, and there is a cyber culture which flourishes. In the virtual ethnography, the cyberspace or the virtual space, it becomes synonymous with the internet itself, whereas the internet and the cyberspace could be two different things, but they become synonymous. The virtual identity, which is how people could perform different and alternative online identities, is something which is of interest to virtual ethnography. So, these ethnographers would also look at the social way that identity would operate, and then in the digital space, how computer mediated interaction was changing our own understanding of self and self identity, and to what extent virtual identities were free from the social and cultural constraints of real life, whose socialization shaped virtual communities. These questions were some of the issues that were addressed by the virtual ethnographers, that they wanted to understand whether or not the cyberspace could operate isolatedly from the real world. That was a big question in front of virtual ethnographers who were dealing with this at multiple levels. The ethnographic gaze, which is coming together of individuals via computer mediated interaction, development of common rules, collective norms and values, sense of belonging, that sort of also created an understanding of the virtual space as a social space. The early ethnographic studies, which were related to communication studies, they were also primarily rooted in what would be audience reception research, where the meanings were constructed by audiences by taking mass media popular culture as their referent. Now, these studies focused on construction of meaning by audiences, and audience reception research was very crucial to this particular way of understanding the virtual space. Largely based on a priori attribution of properties of the web by establishing a comparison with the physical world and face-to-face relationship. So, the dichotomy that the virtual and the real world presented was very crucial to this kind of an understanding. The cyberspace was seen as unifying ethnographic field site, because all kinds of social life occurring on the internet using different kinds of practices etc. came together in this cyberspace, and therefore, a study of the cyberspace was seen as a reflection of the diversity in terms of how people represented themselves digitally. The ethnography of virtual worlds also primarily meant that there were epistemological and methodological response to the challenges of virtual worlds or metaverses, especially in what would be online game cultures. Exclusively online ethnographies that justified their methodological strategy by pointing basically to how they limited their object of study to virtual cultures also used this kind of a distinction between the virtual and the real. Now, this is not an assumption of the ethnographer, but has to be explained through fieldwork. So, what this means is that if you are making a distinction between the virtual and the actual or the real world, then you have to also prove it that this distinction exists. For instance, today that kind of a digital ethnographic world where this distinction exists is not really possible, primarily because the digital or what would be the virtual has also become the real. So many things are happening digitally, but are happening in the real world. It is not only about a representation of an idea, it is, actual operative unfolding. So, what you have is also a desire to then say that if you are making this distinction, then you have to evidentially prove it. Now, connective ethnography, the second kind, here the internet, an ethnographic approach by Daniel Miller and Don Slater did a situated study of the internet. Situated study means that it is contextualized, it is located within the social structure. Online or offline as a form of recognition of the multiple connections and the close relationship between these two social grounds. You can already see that the perspective has shifted, where now people are talking about the two in coexistence rather than in separation. Christine Heen looks at the principles for virtual ethnography from a multi-sited and connective notion of ethnography. The multi-sitedness is important as traditional ethnography since the 1990s have moved on to also ethnographies not of a single community or site, but of multiple sites and communities. What this means is that field research in the ethnographic sense is not limited to a particular place geographically. It could be multi-sited in nature. Let us take an example. For instance, if you want to trace the lives of Indian migrants living outside, you might want to look at the kind of life that they lived in India. So, India becomes a field site, and then the country that they have migrated to, then it becomes another field site. So, you have a multi-sitedness. Now, in virtual ethnography also there is a multi-sitedness which presents a connective notion of that ethnography. So, what happens is that you could observe multiple sites in the digital space, and participant observation of web pages, their links with the mass media system. It enables the understanding of the field site as an empirical locale where research is conducted. Now, understanding of the field site as an empirical locale where research is conducted. This primarily means that the connected nature of what would be also an approach to digital ethnography needs to be understood. So, how do we understand this connected nature better? For instance, you might want to trace how young people behave in the digital space along with their social spaces and also on multiple digital platforms. So, you might want to see how they behave on Instagram versus on Facebook or on LinkedIn or on WhatsApp, and then also how they behave in their social lives. So, this is a multi-sited digital and a traditional ethnography, because you collect data in the social space, you integrate and you connect it with the digital space, and you observe different kinds of social platforms. So, what you have is a connecting nature. Now, fieldwork inside and outside the screen explores relationships between online and offline interactions. This is an important way of how we can think about digital ethnography, that you need to do fieldwork inside the screen and then outside the screen as well. For instance, if you are interested, let us say, in finding out how digitally a particular food item is represented, and you follow a content analysis kind of a method to trace how it is represented, it would also be advisable to see how that food item is considered outside the screen. So, we are no longer talking about the real versus the real world or the digital versus the actual world, but what we are talking about is that how do we look at it inside the screen and outside the screen. So, for instance, if one has to understand how online education operates, it is also important to not only look into the infrastructures of the digital educational space, but also to sort of know that how would the social cultural context be adapting to that digital technology, and vice versa, which is how does the digital technology adapt to the social cultural conditions. So, the internet is now the place where both online and offline meet. It is no longer operating in isolation, it is primarily a space where there is a coming together of the online and the offline. So, if one goes on a trip, that is real, and then what they post is also a part of the real, because they are curating their timeline on their social media platform with this idea that the trip is connected to sharing of the memories. Now, the study of the internet should mean keeping the vision of both sides at the same time. So, it is no longer possible to ignore one in favor of the other, as has been historically the case. Now, the issue of integrating research across online and offline situations also means that digital ethnography needs to be combined with other qualitative or quantitative research methods which many researchers do. For instance, there is a lot of work that illustrates digital ethnography in combination with life history interviews or interviews in general, and then data is collected and produced. What you see is the construction of the field site as a heterogeneous network which maps out the social relationships of the subjects and their connections to material and digital objects and to physical or virtual worlds. So, within the parameter of digital ethnography, what we have is an interconnectedness between the physical and the real worlds, and a methodological technique which not only enables you to understand digital representations and social relations, but also their social, cultural and economic implications. For instance, to give an example, if one has to do a study of digital modes of payment like UPI, it will be clear clearer that it has a social connection to urban as well as younger populations. So, while rural areas and older people may be using these payment apps, it is also a possible explanation that the young people in urban areas are more into the digital modes of payment, and that is connected to how socially and culturally they are a part of this information and digital age, whereas the older generations may not have been. So, you are born with knowledge of how to operate in this kind of economy and society. So, what you see is an application of an ethnographic method rooted in studying the digital, maybe theoretically, maybe sociologically, but also empirically and methodologically. So, we will continue this discussion further in the next lecture. Thank you.